President Trump told reporters that he, quote, consulted with everybody. I always consult with everybody. But if that's true, why were even some of his closest advisors left in the dark, even at the Pentagon?
Yeah, 2 U.S. officials have told NPR that military leaders directly involved in countering ISIS were caught off guard by Trump's sudden policy shift. Late on Sunday, the White House announced that U.S. troops will withdraw from an area near the Syrian border with Turkey. This is where Kurdish forces allied with the U.S. have been helping the Trump administration fight ISIS. But Turks see those Kurdish forces as terrorists. And if the United States leaves, that clears the way for Turks to attack those Kurdish militias. Even President Trump's closest friends in Congress say this is no way to treat an ally and that the move will undercut U.S. foreign policy in the region. Here's Republican Senator Lindsey Graham speaking on Fox News.
I expect the American president to do what's in our national security interest. It's never in our national security interest to abandon an ally who's helped us fight ISIS. It's never in our national security interest to create conditions for the reemergence of ISIS.
All right, we've got NPR's Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman with us this morning. So, Tom, you spoke with 2 U.S. officials on the condition of anonymity. What did they tell you?
Well, Rachel, they said they're stunned and also worried, and there are several concerns. They fear Turkey will launch a military operation into northeast Syria and leave the American allied Kurdish forces alone to fight Turkey. They worry those Kurdish forces will also abandon the anti-ISIS fight to focus on Turkey. Now, the caliphate is no more, as President Trump says, but what he failed to say is ISIS is regrouping and slipping back into cities and towns, mounting assassinations, bombings. One of the U.S. officials who spoke with NPR says this is reminiscent of last December when the president abruptly said he wanted all 2,000 U.S. troops out of Syria. Pentagon officials convinced Trump to keep about 1,000 troops in northeast Syria to continue the fight against ISIS.
So the actual physical caliphate may have been destroyed, but you just said there ISIS is still clearly a threat. What does the Pentagon say about what appears to be a retreat, right? I mean, is the U.S. abandoning the fight against ISIS altogether?
Well, no, they're not. But they do say, again, ISIS is regrouping and could gain even more strength. There's still thousands of ISIS fighters who have kind of gone to ground in Syria and Iraq. U.S. troops are working with local forces to go after them. So again, this pullback of U.S. forces in the possible military operation by Turkey could make all that worse. And besides that, of course, there are many civilians who get caught in the crossfire here. I mean,
and it seems, if you outsource this fight to Turkey, is it really going to work? Because does Turkey share the same priorities? If the U.S. wants and has been fighting with these Kurds against ISIS, does Turkey really want to get rid of ISIS, or do they really just want to get rid of the Kurds?
Their focus is on the Kurds. They see the Kurds in Syria as aligned with the Kurds they call terrorists in Turkey. So they're going to definitely focus on the Kurds as opposed to ISIS. But the problem is in going after the Kurds and as what some say is abandoning the U.S. ally, they'll just make matters worse by having ISIS just move into the breach.
All right, NPR's Tom Bowman for us this morning. Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome, Rachel.
There is a new name attached to the impeachment inquiry, a man by the name of Gordon Sondland.
Right. Okay. So he's the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. And because of a series of text message conversations he was part of, he is now a key witness in the impeachment hearings. Today, he's going to testify in a closed-door deposition on Capitol Hill. Those online messages were handed over to Congress as evidence last week. And the House Intelligence Committee will want to know more about Sondland's interactions with Ukrainian officials.
NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez has been digging into Sondland's background and joins us now. Hey, Franco.
Hi.
What do we know about him?
Well, we know that Gordon Sondland is a big Republican donor who, like Trump, made his money managing hotels. It appears that he hasn't held a full-time position in government before this. He's what's known as a political appointee. But he did have support from Democrats as well. Here's Ron Wyden, a Democratic senator from Oregon, during the nomination process.
If you look at the totality of the experience that the Sondlands bring to this post, at a time when lots of politics is polarized and divisive, Gordon Sondland's going to be a really good fit.
Interestingly, relations with Trump were not always great. Sondland backed out of a Seattle fundraiser in 2016 after Trump criticized the parents of a Muslim American soldier. Sondland himself is a son of Jewish parents who escaped persecution from Germany. But any hard feelings really didn't last that long because Sondland later donated $1 million to the president-elect's inaugural fund. Some Democrats now, though, are already calling for him to resign amid this controversy. 12, according to an NBC survey. They include Tim Ryan of Ohio, Lloyd Doggett of Texas. Others are saying they want to wait till after the testimony.
Okay, so that's helpful in understanding kind of where he came from and his relationship with the president. But how did he get embroiled in the Ukraine scandal? I mean, he's the U.S. ambassador to the EU, but Ukraine isn't even part of the EU, right?
Right. It's odd. My sources close to the administration tell me that it's not regular for an EU ambassador to be dealing with the Ukraine. That's something that Democrats are obviously going to want to learn more about during his testimony. There are already other players there. Kurt Volker, who is a special envoy working to end the conflict of Russia with Russia. Energy Secretary Rick Perry. He's engaged in energy talks. But Sondland got close to Trump. He even told Ukrainian TV that Trump gave him a special assignment overseeing relations between the two countries.
We have what are called the Three Amigos, and the Three Amigos are Secretary Perry, again, Ambassador Volker, and myself. And we've been tasked with sort of overseeing the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
The Three Amigos.
Yeah, and I should say this is all happening as Trump and his officials were pushing out the then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who's going to talk later.
Right. So what kinds of questions are the House Democrats going to put to him today?
Well, as you know, he's at the center of the Ukraine matter. One of the first questions is likely to be about those texts to Kurt Volker about Trump wanting a deliverable. He appeared to be talking about an invitation for the Ukraine president to Washington being tied to commitments of an investigation to the Biden family. He'll also be asked about a July 19th text exchange about securing cooperation from the Ukraine president. Sondland told diplomats after talking to Zelensky that he got it. The deposition today is closed, but you can expect some really revealing answers to those kind of questions will come out.
All right, NPR's Franco Ordonez following it for us. Thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so last night, the Trump administration announced that it's adding 28 Chinese organizations to a trade blacklist because of human rights abuses.
Right, specifically the detention of 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities in China. Beijing says these detentions are a counterterrorism measure. China's government also claims that the detention camps are actually vocational training centers and that China has released most of the people held there.
NPR's Beijing correspondent Emily Fang, though, found a different story. She joins us now. Hey, Emily.
Hi, good morning.
So you've been reporting the story about Uyghurs who are detained in China. But to report this out, you went to neighboring Kazakhstan. Explain why.
Yep. Well, it's because it's not just Uyghurs who are being detained. There are other ethnic minorities, including Kazakhs, who have been detained, and they have family in Kazakhstan, where it's so much easier to talk to people instead of physically going to Xinjiang, which I have been to, and where I'm often physically followed and intimidated by local security.
Xinjiang, we should say, is the province in China where they have these detention camps for Uyghurs and other minorities.
Yes, the region in China. So for this story, I went to Almaty, Kazakhstan. And when I was there, I talked to 31 people who had relatives detained in Xinjiang, or they themselves had been detained in Xinjiang, and they described how they knew 32 relatives or friends who had, in this year alone, been given prison sentences of 5 to 20 years. And their friends and relatives had been sentenced in these show trials, basically, where there was no legal counsel present, there was nothing but a verdict read out, and they clearly were targeting people with religious backgrounds. Of the 32 people we learned had been sentenced, 23 of them were imams, religious students, or prayed 5 times a day, all of which are activities that are constitutionally allowed in China. Here's Gulbaran Omarali, a Kazakh woman whose nephew, Bahadati Akin, was just sentenced to 15 years this year.
He was 13 when he attended 2 months of religious courses. I do not understand why something so long ago and which was legal at the time is now a crime.
So yes, China is moving people out of detention camps they've constructed all over Xinjiang, but it's not like these people are walking free and going home. They're being sent to rapidly expanding prisons through these sham trials. And by sentencing them to prison, China's effectively formalizing this detention system, which they built up really quickly, and at the time arguably didn't have a legal basis.
So what are these families and people who've actually been released, who haven't been sent to prison, what are they telling you about their lives?
Yeah, I did talk to a few relatives who said, you know what, their loved ones had been released, but Xinjiang has built up a surveillance state through on-the-ground policing and technology that's so advanced that even these detainees who go home are essentially under watch all the time. They're in this open-air prison. They still have to report their weekly activities. They have to get permission to travel. I even talked to one woman who said her sister got married this year but had to ask for permission first.
So they can't just leave, right? They're living, they're free, quote unquote. But this living in this heavy surveillance kind of state, you would think they would want to just get out, but they can't, presumably.
Yeah, one thing that we discovered was some people have been allowed to leave this year. They've been able to get passports and visit family in Kazakhstan, but they have to keep guarantors, basically human collateral or loved ones who will be punished if they don't come back to China and if they tell people too much about what's happening in Xinjiang.
Wow, so they have to actually name someone, a family member or a friend. Wow. NPR's Emily Fang, thank you so much for following this. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Rachel.
How far can President Trump go in defying the will of Congress?
The president faces demands for witnesses and documents for a House impeachment inquiry. The White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, sent a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi last night. And the lawyer's argument in this letter tracked very closely with the president's own political rhetoric. It accused Democrats of trying to, quote, overturn the results of the 2016 election. The White House counsel says the whole inquiry process has been unfair and that they will not cooperate. The letter came the same day the Trump administration blocked a key witness from testifying. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel spoke to NPR yesterday.
If anyone fails to cooperate with this inquiry, we'll consider it obstruction and we'll presume they have something to hide and we'll move on from there.
NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson is covering this test of power between Congress and the White House. Mara, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
Let's just look at the lawyer's letter here briefly. The letter makes reference to the Constitution, so we can start with that. Who has the power of impeachment under the Constitution?
Article 1 of the Constitution gives, quote, the sole power of impeachment to the House of Representatives. The Constitution doesn't offer many rules about how impeachment works. So the House pretty much gets to make those rules themselves. And of course, we only have two modern impeachments to go by for how it's been done in the past, which is Nixon and Clinton.
Okay, those processes.
Impeachment inquiries.
Right, exactly. One ended in an actual impeachment in a Senate trial. Now, the White House lawyer then complains about the rules, said the process was unfair because the president can't cross-examine witnesses and call his own witnesses, which sounds reasonable at a glance, but is it normal for a president to get to call his own witnesses at hearings before the House of Representatives?
Well, impeachment in the House is kind of like a grand jury deciding whether or not to indict a president. The actual trial occurs in the Senate, which acts as the jury to decide whether the president should be convicted and removed or acquitted. So the time to cross-examine witnesses would generally be in the Senate. Now, the White House, the senior administration officials who briefed reporters yesterday claimed that President Clinton's counsel was able to question some witnesses in the House, but certainly most of the questioning of witnesses occurs in the Senate at a trial.
Okay, so not as much to that argument as it might seem at first glance. There's also a complaint that the full House has not voted on whether to begin an impeachment inquiry. Is it required that they do?
It certainly isn't required. In the Nixon impeachment and in the Clinton impeachment, there was a vote. One of the arguments that Republicans are making is if you have a vote, once you have a vote and a formal inquiry starts, then the minority gets the right to call witnesses and cross-examine them. But that's also not written in the Constitution. Even if there was a vote, Nancy Pelosi could decide that Republicans wouldn't have that opportunity.
We're dwelling on these details because this is a question of power. Who gets to control things? So that leads to the next question. Suppose the House went along with all these White House demands. Would the White House then cooperate, produce witnesses, produce documents, everything else?
The senior administration officials were asked about that over and over again yesterday, and they said that's a hypothetical. In other words, they would not commit to cooperating even if certain criteria were met.
Okay, so this is the essential rejection of cooperation by the White House with the House of Representatives. How does the House of Representatives respond?
This is a huge separation of powers clash. The House has said that they would consider non-cooperation to be obstruction, and that could be another article of impeachment, the way it was during the Nixon impeachment hearings. Now we assume this goes to court. It could be dragged out all the way until the election. But the question is, do Democrats feel they're certainly not going to get any more cooperation or witnesses or documents from the administration, but do they feel that's necessary for them to go forward, or do they have enough to go on already?
Mara, thanks for now. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Mara Eliason. So much more to say on this story. A vital question in Syria today is who moves in to parts of northern Syria as U.S. forces move out.
Right. President Trump started the week by announcing a plan to back out of the border region between Turkey and Syria. That appeared to then clear the way for Turkey to send in its own military, which then raised a lot of concerns that Turkey could then attack Kurdish forces who have been helping the U.S. fight ISIS. And even the president's closest allies are worried about this. They're worried that the U.S. is basically leaving a vacuum that ISIS could now fill.
NPR national security correspondent Hannah Alam is covering this story. She's in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is the theory of how ISIS would benefit from a U.S. withdrawal from parts of Syria?
Well, the area we're talking about was crucial to ISIS. Raqqa is there. That was the capital of the so-called caliphate it declared. It's a site where we saw a lot of the atrocities ISIS is known for, the beheadings, the people being stoned to death. And so territorially, that caliphate is gone now, but that only happened because of a bloody battle. And the forces that did a lot of that dirty work were Kurdish fighters with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They lost around 12,000 fighters, and they're the ones holding that recaptured territory. They're the ones guarding thousands of ISIS prisoners, and they're the ones in charge of a detention camp packed with families of ISIS fighters. But the Syrian Kurds say they can't do all of that and confront Turkey.
Okay, I understand that, but of course the president takes this from an entirely different point of view and essentially says we were there to destroy the ISIS caliphate. The caliphate is destroyed. Why not back out?
And I think counterterrorism analysts would say that's a really tough case to make given the fragility of the situation there and the shift that ISIS itself is undergoing. It lost its land. Now it's moving back to its insurgent roots. Overnight, we're hearing reports of possible ISIS attacks in Raqqa. So yes, the caliphate's gone, but ISIS is not vanquished. I spoke with Hassan Hassan. He's from this part of eastern Syria, and he's with the Center for Global Policy in Washington. He warns that the U.S. needs the Syrian Kurds and says this is not the right time to break the partnership.
You lose the most effective force against ISIS. Even if this force is replaced by another force, just a mere change of hands will create security gaps for ISIS to exploit, rebuild its influence, and rise again in those areas.
Okay, so that's the view of an analyst. You also have for us here, the view of a Kurdish group, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. We've got tape here from General Mazlum Kobani Abdi through an interpreter. Here's what he had to say.
So in case of the American withdrawal from the border areas and invasion the Turks start their incursion, for sure the one priority for us, it will be to protecting our areas and our families. And we're not focusing on ISIS like we focused before.
Not focusing on ISIS as before? He's saying they're just not going to be available to be U.S. allies.
That's right. I mean, the Kurdish forces have always been clear that their number one concern is not ISIS, but protecting their territory from Turkey. And so if they move their forces into defensive positions, there are serious questions. Who's going to watch the ISIS prisoners? Who's going to keep a presence in those former strongholds? And at this point, it's still fluid. We don't know the scope of the Turkish operations, but we do know the U.S. needs partners to hold these gains. And now the Kurdish fighters are seen as a cautionary tale. It's getting sold out doesn't exactly boost recruitment.
NPR national security correspondent Hannah Alam, thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
A a 17-year-old boy is the youngest person to die of vaping-related illness in the United States.
The Bronx teenager's death brings the number of vaping-related deaths to 23. That's across the country. And public health officials say that number is actually rising, but they're still trying to figure out why. It's led to plenty of warnings about e-cigarettes and put a spotlight on illegal vaping operations.
Illegal vaping operations? NPR's Cheryl Corley is here to tell us what that's about. Hi there, Cheryl.
Hi, good morning.
I had thought of this as an industry that is done by regular corporations. What is an illegal vaping operation?
Well, it's one like authorities say they found in Bristol, Wisconsin. That's where I was, just north of the Wisconsin-Illinois border. There were a couple of brothers and their mother. They've been charged with running an illegal operation. Marijuana is not legal in Wisconsin, and during a raid, authorities found about 30,000 vaping cartridges filled with THC. Of course, that's the ingredient that gets you high in marijuana. They also found thousands more unfilled cartridges and mason jars full of THC oil, all with a street value of about $1.5 million. The brothers, 20-year-old Tyler Huffhines and 23-year-old Jacob Huffhines, have been charged in the case, and has their mother, Courtney Huffhines. The sheriff there, Kenosha County Sheriff David Beth, alleges the brothers and their mother built a tiny empire in about 20 months.
We had no clue this was going on. We had no clue that this was really an industry. It's caught us all off guard, and it's made us very aware of this is a problem. Tip of the iceberg, I think, throughout the entire country.
And of course, authorities haven't figured out what's causing all these illnesses, but they say the underground market may be a culprit.
Oh, so we have one question about whether irregular products made in this irregular or illegal way might be part of the reason for the illnesses. But that's not the only concern here, right? Aren't legal vaping products also of serious concern to officials?
Yes. And it has a lot to do with an increase in young people, particularly high school students, vaping flavored nicotine-based products. And there's concern about how these products are marketed. Often those devices are put in boxes that look really kid-friendly, very colorful, cartoon-like images. And advocates, though, say that these nicotine-based vaping products actually help people trying to quit smoking, and the focus should be instead on what they consider a more likely culprit, those THC-based e-cigarettes purchased in the underground market.
Well, have health officials found any common link in these assorted illnesses and deaths across the country?
Not really. Health officials say they're still trying to identify a link. Most patients, though, have reported vaping with THC liquids, some as well with nicotine. So the CDC and the Food and Drug Administration and state health departments have issued warnings telling people just to stop using e-cigarettes and to stop any sort of vaping altogether. They also say people trying to break a smoking habit shouldn't go back to cigarettes, but try some other methods to quit.
NPR Cheryl Corley, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
They're known as the Beatles because of their British accents. ISIS fighters accused of brutally executing U.S. hostages and other foreigners. Two of these fighters had been captured and detained in northern Syria and were being guarded by U.S. allied Kurdish forces.
But those Kurdish forces are now busy because they're under attack by another U.S. ally, Turkey. So the U.S. has taken custody of the ISIS prisoners. Turkish airstrikes and shelling began yesterday. President Trump helped clear the way for this attack by moving some U.S. troops out of the way. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended the move on the PBS NewsHour last night.
The Turks have a legitimate security concern. They have a terrorist threat to their south.
The, quote, terrorist threat to which Pompeo refers are Kurdish militant groups that have been key to the U.S.-led fight against ISIS.
NPR's Daniel Estrin is on the ground reporting from just over the border from Syria in Iraq. Daniel, just explain exactly where you're situated right now and what you can tell us about what you're learning about the Turkish assault.
I'm in the town of Dohuk. It's about a 40-minute drive from the Syrian border crossing. And Turkey has announced its ground incursion into Syria. Kurdish activists say the Turkish army and its allied forces have crossed the border, have entered Syrian villages, and have clashed with Kurdish-led forces. There are airstrikes on a border town. Earlier, Turkey said its warplanes struck at Kurdish forces targets, several villages as well. And Kurdish activists are reporting at least 7 civilians killed, including 2 children. more than a dozen people reportedly wounded, and reports of more than a dozen Kurdish fighters killed. And all of this is happening in an area on the border where Turkey wants to create a buffer zone to clear the area of Kurdish forces. Turkey sees those forces as enemies, as connected to Kurdish insurgents inside Turkey.
The same people who the U.S. has viewed as allies in the fight against ISIS. So you've been talking to people who actually live in this area that's under attack. What have they been telling you?
Well, we spoke to some Kurdish activists who are describing really total panic that began yesterday afternoon when Turkey declared the beginning of its operation. One Kurdish activist we spoke with, Sevinaz Evdike, she's 27 years old. She said she'd come home from demonstrating against Turkey on the border. She was ready to make food. And then the house shook. They went up to the roof, and they could make out in the distance where Turkey had apparently bombed near the border. And then she said a school was struck near her house, and the streets were flooded with people trying to flee. Take a listen to her.
Imagine a whole city that is trying in one moment to go out of the city and just have one road to go out. And trying to go, and then every time it bombs, they terrify and they start to run all over.
And she says she's frustrated with President Trump. She says he's tweeting from thousands of kilometers away and shaping our fate.
So I want to ask you about those ICE prisoners that we mentioned. This has been a big concern. These high-profile ISIS fighters who have now been moved into U.S. custody. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, Trump called them the worst of the worst. Part of a group known as the Beatles. They're accused of being responsible for beheading two American freelance journalists, James Foley and Steven Sotloff, an American aid worker, Peter Kassig, and other foreign hostages. And Trump tweeted that in the case of the Kurds, in case the Kurds or Turkey lose control, these high-profile detainees are in U.S. custody.
Any sign how far Turkey's going to go with this?
Turkey isn't saying how much land they're trying to seize, how long they intend this operation to last, not giving many details on its ground troops. Trump says we'll see how Erdogan does it. If he does it unfairly, he'll pay a big economic price.
NPR's Daniel Estrin for us on the Syrian border. Thanks so much, Daniel.
You're welcome.
Negotiators for the U.S. and China meet in Washington today. Taken together, they represent something like 40% of the entire world's economy.
And they remain in a trade war that is seen as posing a danger to that economy. The meeting comes days before the U.S. plans to further increase tariffs, this time targeting some $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. So how close can the talks this week get to a ceasefire?
To get a better idea of what to expect, we are joined by NPR's chief economics correspondent, Scott Horsey. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, Rachel.
So President Trump told reporters this week he wants a, quote, big deal with China. He said this before. This has been the challenge all along. There are perhaps more incremental steps that could be taken, but President Trump wants China to make huge changes.
Right, Rachel. Remember when the president launched this trade war a year ago, he wanted China to halt the forced transfer of American technological know-how. He wanted them to stop subsidizing their government-controlled businesses. He wanted China to open its markets to more American exports, really change the way China does business.
So how likely is that? I mean, especially this week, is that likely to come out of these talks?
That's a pretty tall order. Matthew Goodman, who's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says it's probably too tall to actually deliver at this point.
I think a big deal is very unlikely. The differences between the two sides are too great, and the sort of underlying competitive forces are too strong right now to really suggest the possibility of a big deal.
Goodman, who worked in both the George W. Bush and Obama White Houses, says the best the U.S. might hope for right now is a more limited agreement that would perhaps suspend the Trump tariffs in exchange for some modest commitments on the part of China to buy more American farm goods.
So is that even likely? I mean, are they close to that?
Yeah, some observers I spoke with say even a skinny deal like that might be out of reach at this point. Certainly China would go along, and Beijing has already been upping its purchases of soybeans. But the administration doesn't exactly be rolling out the welcome mat this week. The Commerce Department just added more than 24 Chinese entities to a export blacklist to protest the treatment of Muslim Uyghurs in northwestern China. Right. The administration's also been denying visas to Chinese officials associated with that treatment. Some observers would cheer the White House for taking this stand on human rights, but others are asking, what took so long and why do it now, just as the trade talks are about to get underway? Finally, you got an administration that's distracted by the impeachment process, and who knows how that affects the trade talks.
So, I mean, we've sort of been here before, right? I mean, we've seen these negotiations come and go. What happens if all these negotiators are here, they get in a room, and they emerge, and there is still no deal, big or skinny?
In that case, the trade war grinds on, and in fact, it's set to escalate. We've got new higher tariffs already in the pipeline. If there's no agreement this week, tariffs are set to jump from 25 to 30% next week on $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. And then don't forget, there's still another round of tariffs set to kick in December. And unlike most of the tariffs we've seen up to this point, those December tariffs would fall pretty heavily on consumer goods like laptop computers and cell phones. The White House put those off until December to avoid hurting the holiday shopping season. But if we get through the holidays with no agreement, Rachel, consumers could be looking at a very costly new year.
NPR's Scott Horsley. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
Okay, over the summer, we introduced you to a woman named Victoria Gray. She has sickle cell disease,
a genetic blood disorder that causes excruciating pain.
It's like being in a car accident and having lightning in your chest. It's pain that makes a grown woman like me scream.
But back in July, Victoria became the first patient with a genetic disorder to get treated in the United States with the powerful gene editing technique CRISPR.
NPR health correspondent Rob Stein has had exclusive reporting on this story. He recently caught up with Victoria, and he is with us now to share the latest about her journey. Hi, Rob.
Oh, hey, Rachel.
So we heard a little bit there, but just remind us about Victoria's story, why she volunteered for this medical experiment. I guess she just felt desperate.
Yeah, well, Victoria, she has sickle cell disease, and as you said, it's a terrible genetic disorder that causes deformed sickle-shaped red blood cells, and they kind of clog up the bloodstream and cause all kinds of awful health problems, including those, agonizing bouts of pain that you just heard her describe.
So she volunteers. She raises her hand. She says, sure, I'll try this experimental treatment. Remind us what that is exactly and how it is supposed to work.
Yeah, so what doctors did is they removed cells from her bone marrow, from Victoria's bone marrow, and then they sent them off to a lab where scientists edited a gene in the cells using this gene editing technique, CRISPR, which makes it really easy to rewrite DNA. And then they infused billions of these modified cells back into her body. This was back in July. The hope is that'll hopefully give her healthy red blood cells. And as you mentioned, I visited her again recently in Nashville where she got this experimental treatment. And Victoria calls her edited cells, she calls them her super cells.
Super cells, yes. Yes, they got to be super, do great things in my body, and to help me be better, and help me have more time with my kids and my family.
Rachel, I asked her, what's it like to have these edited cells living inside your body? Is it weird to have genetically modified cells in your body?
No, I'm just genetically modified now. I'm a GMO. Is that what they call it?
At least you can laugh about all this.
Yeah, she's got a great personality.
What's happening with her now?
So the day I saw her, she was packing up to go home to Mississippi to see her 4 kids for the first time in months and to find out whether, her super cells are working. And the hope is, that if the therapy is working and is safe, that it could help her and many, many other sickle cell patients live normal lives.
Right. So what happens next?
So, Victoria's going to go back to Nashville once a month for 4 months for checkups and blood tests and other follow-up tests to see if these super cells are working. And doctors will follow her for years to make sure the cells are safe and to see if they're helping her live a healthier, longer life. And I asked her what it's like to be waiting at this period.
Well, I'm spiritual, Robin. It's something I prayed about, and just the way everything happened for me, I just feel like it was fate for me to be here. So I just believe that, God is doing this for me. That's all I can say. So, yes, pray.
Yeah, so Rachel, we're going to continue to follow her through this journey, and we're going to bring, updates every once in a while.
We're going to be thinking about her. NPR health correspondent Rob Stein. Thank you, Rob.
You bet, Rachel.
The fear among many in the region was if the U.S. got out of the way in Syria, some longtime U.S. allies would be vulnerable, and that is now happening.
Yeah, the Turkish military is on its third day of strikes against Kurdish targets in northern Syria. The invasion has been widely condemned, not just by President Trump's critics, but by his most loyal supporters, too. Turkey says it's going after terrorists, but those same Kurdish forces fought alongside Americans for years against ISIS before President Trump pulled U.S. troops, which then gave Turkey a clear path to attack. Now, President Trump says the only response boils down to three choices: send in the military, hit Turkey with economic sanctions, or hope that his administration can mediate a deal between Turkey and the Kurds.
Let's go to the region now. NPR's Peter Kenyon is in southeastern Turkey and joins us. Hi, Peter.
Hi, David.
So you are right near the border with Syria where all of this is going on. What are you seeing and how is this operation playing out so far?
Well, the scene is one of black smoke on the Syrian side and the occasional attack on the Turkish side. The figures from the Turkish Defense Ministry have been rising steadily. Yesterday, they said nearly 180 Kurdish militants had been neutralized. Today, that figure was up to 277. Those numbers aren't confirmed. They could certainly change. Turkish civilian fatalities are standing at 6, we're told, with 7 Syrian civilians reportedly killed, and Turkey has 1 military fatality. Most of the attacks are from Turkey into Syria, but as I mentioned, there was also a series of attacks on the town of Akçakale in Turkey yesterday that led to the Turkish civilian deaths, and people are fleeing some areas on both sides of the border.
Well, Rachel mentioned some of the international criticism of this Turkish operation. What is the reaction there? What voices are you hearing there?
Well, obviously, we're hearing some positive support from some of the Turkish residents. There even have been marches in support. And then, of course, there's some very worried, very frightened Syrians down on the border yesterday. There are rows of houses right within sight of the border. Many of them are empty, but outside one, we ran into Yusuf Saleh with his wife, 8 children, a number of other relatives. He said the noise of the mortars and rockets was scaring his children, but now they're starting to get used to it. He said he's from just across the border at Ain Issa in Syria, and he had made arrangements to move out of the border area, but he wasn't doing so for now. Here's some of what he said. Now, what he's saying there is everyone's terrified right now, but if the Turkish army clears out the area around his town on the Syrian side, he would immediately go back there, even if he had to walk. He said he arranged for Turkish documents to move to another province, but because he found his relatives living here, he decided to stay close to them.
How far does the Turkish military intend to go here into Syria if they continue this?
Well, it seems they're staying within their stated limit of an area about 20 miles deep into Syria. Eventually, they want to stretch that so it's 300 miles wide all the way to the Iraqi border. At the moment, they're nowhere near that wide. But if and when such a safe zone is established, Turkey plans to return some 1 to 2 million Syrian refugees there.
Has the Turkish government responded to all the criticism we've heard of this operation from the international community, Peter?
Yes, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been defiant. He says this is a counterterrorism operation and the world should support it. World leaders and humanitarian groups are not doing that. Humanitarian groups in particular are warning of hundreds of thousands of people potentially at risk if this goes on.
All right, NPR's Peter Kenyon in southeastern Turkey with a close-up view of that military operation that has begun in northern Syria. You mentioned. Peter, thanks a lot.
Thanks, David.
All right, President Trump lashed out at Democrats and leveled some personal attacks at his political rivals in his first campaign rally since the impeachment inquiry began.
Yeah, he told supporters in Minneapolis last night the Democrats' impeachment probe would help him at the polls in 2020.
The Democrats' brazen attempt to overthrow our government will produce a backlash at the ballot box, the likes of which they have never, ever seen before in the history of this country.
The president also took special aim at Joe Biden, crudely describing Biden's relationship with President Obama. This comes after the former vice president called for President Trump's impeachment for the first time this week. And Biden's not alone in that regard. A new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll shows that a slim majority of Americans now approve of the impeachment inquiry. The new NPR results are in line with other prominent polls, including one from Fox News that showed a majority of registered voters now support Trump's impeachment and removal from office.
All right, let's bring in NPR senior political editor and correspondent Domenico Montanaro. Hi, Domenico.
Hey there, David.
So what stood out to you in this campaign event last night?
You know, it was mostly a greatest hits, but he talked about how much he thinks the impeachment inquiry is illegitimate, and he continued these false attacks on the Bidens. And it really shows that even in a state like Minnesota, which Trump lost narrowly, he's not reaching out to the middle. And that was highlighted last night by these tense protests that took place outside the arena. And it's really emblematic of just how locked in most of the country is. Most people are either strongly against Trump or firmly in his corner.
Well, if he's appealing to his base in a room like that, it shouldn't be surprising at all if he's using like explosive rhetoric, profanity. I mean, it's part of his appeal to certain voters, right?
Right. He has to keep them locked in. That's exactly what he's been doing and what he's continuing to do.
Does he have reason to be worried about these new polls that Rachel mentioned? We're looking at slim majority now in favor of this impeachment inquiry?
Well, you know, one poll can be an outlier, but multiple are a trend. And several this week showed support for the impeachment inquiry on the rise. I mean, the latest PBS NewsHour NPR Marist poll shows that a slim majority of Americans are now in favor of the inquiry. And that comes because of a big swing with independents, David. They went from being mostly against the inquiry 2 weeks ago to a majority now being in favor.
So the president is making this argument that moving forward with impeachment would basically amount to undoing his 2016 election victory. Is that argument holding weight with people as these polls come out?
Well, I mean, the president and his supporters are going to take some solace, at least, in the fact that almost 6 in 10 people in our poll, said that they would rather see Trump's fate decided at the ballot box rather than through the impeachment process.
Oh, so they support the impeachment inquiry, but would rather the decision be made by voters.
Right. And I think that shows you just how the reason why people have been so reticent to go forward, how cautious Americans generally are on something like impeachment. And that's why you've seen House Speaker Nancy Pelosi be so cautious about going forward with impeachment for so long. But Pelosi and others felt like they had no choice but to go forward as the facts continue to come out about the widening Ukraine controversy. And to that point, our poll also found that more than 2/3 think it's unacceptable for a president to do what Trump did in asking a foreign leader for help investigating a political rival, and 61% think he does not share the moral values of most other Americans.
All right, NPR's Domenico Montanaro with covering this event last night and also some new poll numbers about the president and impeachment inquiry. Domenico, thanks as always.
You're so welcome.
All right, so you have the NBA, you have Vans sneakers, you have the animated series South Park. These are all brands that have been caught in China's censorship crosshairs.
And the latest American company to run afoul of Beijing is Apple. After criticism from Chinese state media, the tech giant removed an app that was being used by pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. This is only the latest clash between American businesses and the Chinese government.
And we have NPR technology correspondent Shannon Bond in our studio this morning reporting on this. Hi, Shannon.
Hi, David.
All right, so we're talking about U.S. companies trying to avoid upsetting China because that's an important market. Apple, as Rachel mentioned, is now involved. They've now removed an app that was, as I understand it, helping protesters in Hong Kong?
That's right. This app was called hkmap.live, and activists were using it to crowdsource location of police at the protests so they could avoid them. Now, Apple says it removed the app because there were public safety concerns. The map could be used maybe to target or ambush police. We've also seen Google this week pull a video game where you could pretend to be a protester in Hong Kong. But these things, what's happening right now, it's not just about tech. You mentioned Vans sneakers. They were pulled off shelves by store owners in Hong Kong who were upset that the company had taken entries out of a design contest that referenced the protest. South Park is off the Chinese internet now after an episode they did about making fun of censorship. And just this morning, the NBA canceled media appearances by players in China because of this whole tweet storm issue that they've had earlier the week. So lots going on.
This is amazing. I mean, these are U.S. companies giving in to pressure from an authoritarian government and country, China.
Yeah, well, I mean, China is a big market for these companies. There's 1.4 billion people there, and these companies, they want to sell them stuff. So take Apple. They sold $52 billion worth of iPhones and laptops and AirPods in the Greater China region last year.
Big market.
That's a fifth of their revenue. So
Wow.
it's an important market. They've removed apps from the App Store in mainland China before. Most notably, in 2017, they took down the New York Times. They've also taken down virtual private network apps that would allow people to bypass censorship. And there are other companies that have been strong-armed. Fashion companies had to apologize for selling T-shirts suggesting that Hong Kong and Taiwan were independent. And it's not just China. We're starting to see repercussions back in the U.S. The NBA, at a basketball game just this week in Philadelphia, some fans were kicked out after wearing T-shirts.
Kicked out of a game?
Yeah, so there's a question about, are they exporting censorship back to the U.S.?
Huh. I mean, what does this mean for American companies that want to do business in China? How are they watching this and reacting?
Well, Beijing is really concerned that this movement spreads elsewhere, and there's a sense that criticism from outside threatens stability. So the professors I spoke to say companies have had to walk this careful line, but the Chinese government's just going to become more sensitive, not less, if these protests continue. I mean, these are American icons. They're hugely powerful. They're hugely popular. They're hugely popular in China. If they can't stand up to China, who can?
Wow. Quite a moment for U.S. businesses in this whole relationship with China. NPR's technology correspondent Shannon Bond. Shannon, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
The United States is pulling its forces out of northern Syria, and the Syrian government is moving back in.
To be precise, they're being invited back in. Syrian Kurdish forces remain in northern Syria, U.S. allies in a years-long fight against ISIS. Now the United States is abandoning its allies as their enemies from Turkey advance. So the Kurds have turned to another longtime enemy for help. They're making an alliance with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
NPR's Daniel Estrin has been following all of this from northeastern Syria. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Noelle.
Okay, so this is a big development, or so it seems. The Kurds are now partnering with the Syrians. How significant is this?
It's a huge development. The Kurds were being attacked by Turkey. Turkish-backed forces were moving into towns. There were reported executions of Kurdish fighters. There were airstrikes. And, of course, the U.S. announcing pulling out all of its troops from northeastern Syria. And this forced the Kurds to scramble to protect themselves. And so they struck this deal with the Syrian regime to face off the Turks. The Syrian regime will be recapturing the whole Syrian border with Turkey. And it seems like the regime's forces are moving quickly. They've closed in on a few towns in this border area. We've been asking Syrians here how they feel about all this, how they feel about the Assad regime returning to their area after all these years. And actually, many Kurds here say they're relieved. They say they'd rather have the Syrian government here than Turkey, their sworn enemy. Take a listen to a 19-year-old barber named Sliman. We met him outside his barber shop, and he said, I'm a part of an entire generation of young men who managed to dodge the Syrian military draft, and they're afraid that they could maybe get thrown in jail when the regime comes to town, or even get sent to the front lines. And so they're hoping that there's some kind of a deal that keeps them safe.
You mentioned Syrian Kurds scrambling. You mentioned some of them saying they feel safer now. I mean, on the whole, I know you've been there, you've been talking to people. On the whole, what are they doing?
Well, a lot is going to depend on this agreement between the Kurds and the regime, whether people will feel comfortable staying here or whether they will flee. Some may try to flee across the border to the Kurdistan area of Iraq, where their fellow Kurds are. And we met some people trying to do just that. We met a 70-year-old man, Mohammed Sheikho, with his family in pickup trucks on the side of the road. They had mattresses piled in the back. They were sleeping in the desert.
70-year-old man sleeping in the desert. I mean, it does not sound great for civilians there at this moment. And I wonder, I know you've been there for a few days, and I imagine you have a couple of lasting impressions from this visit. How are people coping?
Well, I think one lasting impression is what we stumbled upon yesterday. We found a church, and a baptism was beginning. Wow. Take a listen to what we heard. So that's the women cheering as the clergymen started to take the young boy and perform the baptism. And it was beautiful because we spoke to the priest who said that he delivered a Sunday sermon to to his followers who said, what do we do? And he said, hold on to your faith.
Extraordinary that this is happening amid so much insecurity. NPR's Daniel Estrin in northern Syria. Thanks, Daniel, so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Noel.
All right. The United States, of course, triggered all of this by ordering U.S. forces out of northern Syria. And today we're learning more exactly about what the U.S.'s plan is here.
Yeah, for a while, U.S. officials minimized just how much territory U.S. forces would be ceding as Turkey invaded the region, and now we have some clarification. Military sources tell NPR that the 1,000 or so U.S. troops involved in anti-ISIS efforts are awaiting orders to withdraw from northern Syria. And Defense Secretary Mark Esper told CBS's Face the Nation that U.S. forces are indeed on their way out.
Well, it'll be a deliberate withdrawal, and we want to conduct it as safely and quickly as possible. So we want to make sure we deconflict a pullback of forces. We want to make sure we don't leave equipment behind. So I'm not prepared to put a timeline on it.
Not prepared to put a timeline on it, he said there. NPR's Tom Bowman covers the Pentagon. He's on the line now. Good morning, Tom.
Hey, Noel.
Okay, so you've been talking to U.S. officials and military commanders in the region. What are they telling you about the withdrawal plan?
Well, it seems, again, all of the hundreds of U.S. troops taking part in the anti-ISIS campaign will start leaving northeast Syria in the coming days. They've been there, of course, for several years working with Kurdish forces to fight ISIS. Now, the ISIS caliphate, of course, is gone because of these efforts, as President Trump has said. What he didn't say is there are still thousands of ISIS fighters remaining as a guerrilla force, seeping into towns and villages, mounting attacks. And the U.S. military really said up until yesterday, when Secretary Esper made his comments, that more work needed to be done. But all that's coming to an end very quickly. And U.S. special operators working with the Kurds are frankly disgusted and ashamed.
Disgusted. We heard Daniel Estrin telling us about civilians scrambling for safety, praying that this all turns out well. For those U.S. forces on the ground in Syria, what circumstances are they in?
Well, as a result of the Turkish invasion, U.S. forces are really stuck in the middle. They have little ability to move. Turkey fired artillery rounds near an American base. Just a couple of days ago, the Turks say they were targeting Kurds. The American soldiers I talked with say it was a warning shot to the Americans. Basically back off, and now the U.S., of course, is backing off and withdrawing completely from northeast Syria.
President Trump still facing a lot of criticism over this move. People accusing him, critics accusing him of abandoning the U.S.'s Kurdish allies. How is the White House responding at this point?
Right. Well, the White House is denying all that, and officials privately say the Kurds knew that the U.S. Wouldn't stay in Syria forever, that this was a transactional relationship, and many thought the Kurds would eventually work out some sort of a deal with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. I was there a couple of times last year in Syria, and they were talking about that at that time. And then, in return, Kurds would get maybe some sort of autonomy in a Syrian state. But again, for the American special operators working on the ground with the Kurds, this precipitous withdrawal, they call it unethical and a betrayal, and it reflects an old saying, they say, the only friends the Kurds have are their mountains.
What is President Trump saying to Turkey, either directly saying to Turkey or trying to telegraph to Turkey at this point?
Well, it seems President Trump wants Turkey to take up the fight against ISIS, but Turkey has only focused on fighting the Kurds. They were never focused on ISIS.
Okay. NPR's Tom Bowman. Tom, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
For 2.5 years, a woman named Fiona Hill was President Trump's top aide on Russia and Ukraine.
Today, House investigators asked what she knew about a shadow policy toward Ukraine. She was that advisor because she was on the National Security Council staff. She is expected to sit for a deposition in the president's impeachment probe. Hill resigned in July, the week before the president made his phone call to Ukraine's president asking for a political rival to be investigated. So what was her role and what did she witness while in the White House?
NPR national security correspondent David Welna has been asking around. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Noel.
So how well did President Trump understand who Fiona Hill was?
Well, there's sort of an interesting story here. At her first NSC meeting with Trump in March 2017, she had a violent headache and she was kind of burrowing down, taking notes. And Trump apparently thought that she was just another staff note taker without quite appreciating just who she was. And I think that says a lot about how Trump didn't quite understand who this person was who'd been recruited by two people who'd already been obliged to leave the NSC. Its very short-lived director, retired General Michael Flynn, and former Fox News commentator Katie McFarland.
Okay, so tell us a bit about Fiona Hill. Who is she?
Well, Fiona Hill was born the daughter of a coal miner in northern England, and she went on to become a top scholar of Russia at Harvard and later at the Brookings Institution. She also served as an intelligence official under both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and notably, unlike Trump, Hill has been quite critical of Russian leader Vladimir Putin's reign. The week after Trump took office, she told a gathering at Harvard that Russia's meddling in the election that brought him to power was, as she put it, an affront to our national security, and she expressed sympathy for the woman who she said was the object of that meddling, Hillary Clinton.
No matter what your position on Hillary Clinton, she's a former First Lady, a former senator, and she was running for public office as a legitimate candidate in a legitimate election, no matter how dirty and contentious this election was.
That is not a statement that would seem to endear her to President Trump. Why did she take this job?
Well, some of her friends got the impression that this was done out of a sense of duty, that she was doing this for the country's sake. She was a professional and she could provide good counsel to the president. One Russia expert who knows Hill well is Georgetown University's Angela Stent. And Stent says it was Hill's main aim while she was on the NSC to make sure, as she put it, that worse things didn't happen when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
What is Fiona Hill likely to be asked by congressional investigators today?
Well, Hill no longer works for this administration, so she's sort of a free agent. There do not appear to be any legal constraints on her appearing before this inquiry. And Angela Stent points out that this is Hill's chance to explain how there was a kind of shadow policymaking process at the White House when it came to Ukraine.
She will certainly explain that the channel that was apparently opened by Ambassador Sondland and Rudy Giuliani, these were things that were going on outside of the purview of the National Security Council.
And Hill's testimony today could also shed light on just what was going on with the $400 million that was put on hold in security assistance for Ukraine, about which the NSC seemed to be in the dark.
NPR's David Welna. David, thanks so much for your reporting. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Noelle.